Hello and welcome to the Enterprise Talk Conversation Series, a peer knowledge resource by the CXOs for the CXOs. Now to our host, Kanika Goswami.
Hi, we welcome you to our podcast On Stage with Enterprise Thought Leaders. My name is Kanika Goswami and I'm the managing editor of On. Media's B2B Enterprise Technology Publications. We have engaging conversations with global thought leaders and industry experts, and most of our conversations reach over more than 1 million business leaders worldwide. One of the most critical discussions today is about energy solutions that enterprises need to adopt to reach a net zero world. We identified Bramble Energy as an award-winning clean tech business, accelerating global decarbonization and powering the transition to a net zero world as a brand that has done pioneering work in this area. So today we are speaking with Dr. Tom Mason, the CEO at Bramble Energy. Welcome to the podcast, Tom. It's lovely to have you here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
A little bit about Dr. Mason. He's a pioneer in the hydrogen fuel cell industry with over a decade of expertise in electrochemistry and clean energy solutions. Since completing his PhD at UCL in 2013, it's over a decade ago, Tom has been at the forefront of groundbreaking hydrogen technologies, notably leading the development of the PCBFC, that is a printed circuit board fuel cell. Not many of us know about it, so we'll presumably be talking about it in a bit. Sorry. As a co-founder of Bramble Energy, Tom initially served as a chief technology officer before becoming the CEO in 2017. He continues to spearhead the company's mission to make clean energy accessible globally. Anything you'd like to add to that about Bramble, Tom?
Really, that Bramble Energy is mission is all about enabling the net zero energy transition by solving the challenges with hydrogen. Hydrogen's is a critical part of the energy transition. It is not the silver bullet that solves the energy transition towards net zero, but it's an important part, particularly for hard to abate sectors. That's hard to transition away from fossil fuels, particularly sectors. And the key challenges that we designed Bramble to solve is all about cost and scale of that industry. How do you achieve that the fastest and the most cost effectively? And that's exactly why we created Bramble and what dominates the purpose of Bramble today.
So in our conversations, we mostly speak to leaders. Most of our questions and our discussion today will be focused on what enterprise leaders can do to get there. And that is where we'd like your opinion. So the first question that I have for you is, what are the leadership challenges for ensuring clean tech across enterprise sectors, especially in industries where it is which are a crucial part of the journey to net zero? What do you think they're facing today, and how do you think they can mitigate those challenges?
Well, I think the biggest challenge faced generally by enterprise, especially, as you said, when we look at hard to abate sectors, so think anything that intensively uses fossil fuels in its day-to-day business, is the need to embrace innovation in terms of solving for net zero. The biggest challenge of net zero is that the technology that's needed to do it without materially affecting people's lives, businesses, doesn't exist. If it did, the market would have already done it. And what's critical for net zero is that it is a market-driven transition. If we propose to achieve net zero through regulation and subsidy, then that is a transition that's paid for by taxation and paid for by taxpayers, and that simply doesn't work. There are no transitions that work when they're purely subsidized by government, because we need to, if we believe we live in a mostly free market economy, then the market economy needs to do it for itself. And so if we think about particularly these hard to abate sectors, and you agree, as I've just proposed, that we don't have the technologies at our disposal today to solve for net zero. We do in some cases, but we don't in all cases. Then the challenge of leadership is to embrace innovation and the future of technology. And especially when it comes to people's business models, right? If it were simple for a logistics business to just sell all their diesel vans and buy electric vans, battery electric vans, then they would have already done it. The fact that they haven't shows that there's a gap. So we must focus on what we need to do to close that gap. My focus at Bramble and what I've spent my career on so far is to solve the technology gap that exists, and I think that's the largest challenge that everybody's got to embrace.
How do you think what would be the best way forward for them to do that? But
well, it really depends on what the business is and where it is in the different sectors. So if you take the sort of the space that Bramble occupies, and that's the hydrogen space, particularly a lot of our focus and commercial traction exists around what we loosely define as mobility. Generally speaking, hydrogen in mobility is for moving heavy things long distances. It's quite a good analogy, sort of summarizes where it's used, and particularly in business settings. There's little suggestion from this industry that hydrogen is a good source of fuel for small city cars. Just doesn't make sense. But were you to look at particular bus routes, truck routes, like commercial vehicle hubs, hydrogen starts to make more sense from a commercial perspective. One of the things that's quite interesting for us at Bramble is that much of the traction comes from where end users make their requirements to make their business model work in a net zero world very clear to the OEMs. And so if you think about Bramble, it's a cornerstone technology company that allows mobility companies to make fuel cells and electrolyzers cost effectively. That's what Bramble's ethos is. So we need OEMs to be able to push things to market. I'm happy to say that many of our customers are doing just that. These things are deep technology. They take time. And realistically, I mean, we're into the 2030s now before hydrogen technology is at true scale, but it is happening everywhere in the world. The real challenge from an enterprise perspective is that, so take a logistics firm. That logistics firm needs to be openly communicating with the market, with their customers, so the people they buy vans from, telling them what they need that van to look like in order for it to be a net zero transition. So I think it's the first thing that people can do, and this is true not just in hydrogen; it's true across all industries. Those enterprises have got to be able to describe what they need from their technologies in order to transition to net zero first. Once you've done that, you can then open up the innovation challenges. People like Bramble will pop up to solve those challenges, but we need to be open about what those challenges are before the innovation can be targeted at those needs.
So in this journey, how do companies handle this change to net zero? It cannot be easy. It's going to cost in terms of expenditure, budgeting. It's going to cost in terms of probably a lot of technological transformation. Is it going to be easy? No. How do you propose companies handle it?
Well, I suppose there's a difference between how I would propose them handle it and how they do it in practice, right? In practice, and this is kind of what I said about a market-driven transition, the companies can embrace more expensive technologies, pass their costs on to consumers, and that means you have an inflationary pressure driving that energy transition, and we want to avoid that, right? I think enterprises, and this is, in fact, I mean, it's broader than enterprises. Consumers, enterprises, governments have to be open to the scope of the challenge to net zero. And often the mistake is to think that the net zero transition is about the grid. It's about the electricity grid. Well, the electricity grid is important, and when you scale your renewable sources, and people are doing that based on the market, right? They're saying, well, it's cheaper for me to build an onshore solar park than it is to build a nuclear plant or whatever, or a coal power plant or whatever. When it's not regulation that's driven coal out of the UK, it's innovation and technology is becoming the dominant type. We've got to think about how we consume fossil fuels and non-renewable sources, and then look at a case-by-case basis what the current technology allows us to do, and is there a possibility of modest increase in costs that can be absorbed in profits or modestly passed on to customers, or does more radical innovation required in order to solve it? And I think that's what every business that's faced with a net zero transition has got to do in its business models. It's got to say, well, what do I have now? What exists in the market today to help me do it? And if it doesn't, I need to clearly define what doesn't work, and then look around the market to try and find that innovation.
So, as we discussed, a small part of this is also technology innovation. Would you be able to identify some specific technology transformations that you think are needed to focus on for clean energy going forward?
Well, let me focus on the ones that are obvious to me, given that I'm in the hydrogen industry, right? So the hydrogen industry requires some innovation, and that's what we hope in part to bring to the market with Bramble Energy and its PCB platform. But really, and that's caused by, and Bramble's technology was a question before it existed, right? So the question that was asked before Bramble started was, how do you solve the problem of scaling and cost down in fuel cells and electrolyzers without investing in lots of capex? Because of course, when you create a new industry, someone has to build the factory, right? And when it is new, there is a lag there, because who's going to spend billions on a factory if there's no market for it, right? And that's the real chicken and egg that exists for hydrogen globally. So Bramble's, ethos was to say, well, how can we solve that problem? How can we use an existing industry? That's what the PCB industry gives us, right? That's just one example, but that only becomes from asking the right question and finding the right people to solve that question. I'm sure there are other answers, but that's the real one, is to pose the right question, find the right answers. That's innovative. Clearly, it doesn't exist. It wasn't simple. It's taken us a decade to get it to work or more, right? So that's these things take time. Got to have patience. The energy transition is going to be you're going to have to be patient. We can't wave a magic wand and then solve it. It's going to take decades, frankly, because we're changing how humanity exists. Humanity exists at the moment by consuming a non-renewable source of energy. We need to change that, and that's going to take a lot of time, costs a lot of money, unless the energy transition is patient, right? If you think about the obsolescence of a gas-fired power plant, no one should be suggesting that tomorrow you turn the taps off, right? That's not an energy transition that works. But if you have a gas-fired power plant that exists anywhere in the world, it will have a lifetime, right? And so the net zero transition is to say, well, in that 20 years, 25 years that plant lasts, how can we have a plan that, without investing the capex that we would have already done in the gas-fired plant, how can we transition that to something else, right? So we all have these challenges over that period of time. We just need to think a bit out over that period of time, and not just try and wave a magic wand and solve it in 5 years.
And so this is not one of the questions I planned on, but as we speak, it's just coming to mind. When there is a technology transformation, there's also a sizable amount of change management involved.
Yes.
And when you're saying it's going to take decades, it's going to probably take 2-3 generations of resources before anything really changes on the ground.
Yep.
Would you have any ideas from your conversations in the industry how leaders are handling that? It's not.
I think it's too early in the transition for anybody to really be handling it yet. I think let's take wind and solar power. The true cost of wind and solar power is not when a grid is going from 0 to 60-70%. The challenge of cost of those renewables is what happens when you go to 70% to 100, intermittency. So, for example, if the grid in the UK was 100% renewable, and we didn't have paid for backup assets that, like gas, that would enable us to basically power our grid with gas, then in the last few weeks we dropped 30 gigawatts of wind because the wind didn't blow. And that's the true cost of renewables. It isn't just the cost of putting up the wind turbine, it's the cost of, but what happens when the wind doesn't blow? And that's what, so we have interconnects, we have, grids that are rich in other sources like the nuclear sources, which are more reliable in France, as an example, next to the UK, and we have interconnects to France. So that solves some of the problem, but that's in a on a grid that is nowhere near 100% yet. So the challenges of renewable energy, as an example, when you get towards that net zero, become much more acute. And the problem is it just isn't being felt now because we have gas-fired plants that can just spool up if we need them to. So as an example, if the grid was all solar and wind in the UK, bit of nuclear, bit of interconnects, the real cost of that is the fact that you'd have to have many gas-fired plants that are kept idle. Someone's got to pay for it. Someone's got to maintain it. Someone's got to keep it all ready to spool back up again. And that's the true cost of that renewable energy. Is the cost of its intermittency. And that's got to be a global challenge, right? Because everybody is richer or poorer in different resources. In Saudi Arabia, they're rich in solar, right? So they're going to have to solve for that problem when it's cloudy, as an example. So we've got to solve this problem on a location by location basis. But the challenges aren't here yet. The challenges are 10, 15 years away. We need to be planning for it now. We need to ask ourselves the question: in a net zero world, is it acceptable to have gas as the backup? Gas is, natural gas is still going to consume fossil fuels. So is it acceptable then? It'd be massively reduced quantity being used per year, but is it acceptable? It's one of the things that hydrogen can solve for, potentially storing excess renewables in the summer to deploy them in the winter when it's not sunny and not windy. It's one of the potential scenarios. But we've got to ask ourselves those questions early enough so that, and you see the media in the UK is constantly focused on the blackouts that may happen if we get a renewable grid. That is the right question to be asked, right? The right question to be asking is, how can we avoid the blackouts before we need to avoid the blackouts, right? We've got to think about these things in connectedly and early enough that we can actually have the solutions in place. But again, also not being naive enough to think that it's going to be cheap. It's not going to be cheap.
So planning ahead, but with the knowledge that we're not there yet.
Yeah, exactly.
We will be there soon, but probably a couple of decades, as you say.
Yeah, I think so.
So as a veteran in the field, what does your experience say about the final impact of energy transformation, if we can call it that? This is apart from the compliances and plans for the 2050, we have to meet some targets. I'm sorry, I'm not very conversant with that because that's not really what we talk about on a daily basis, but I'm sure you can help us understand. So what do you see changing?
I think the biggest impact, well, there's two impacts. The first impact is around stability and prices going forward for people. If you think about most of the volatility in world energy prices today, it happens because of conflicts. It happens because of disruption to trade routes. It happens because all sorts of things. In a net zero world, that largely disappears because we're relying on, we have a lot more energy security. Everybody has a lot more energy security. Everybody's generating their own wind, own solar, own nuclear, own whatever. They're all renewables. They're all located locally. And so actually energy stability becomes much more certain. You can predict exactly, for sake of wind park, you're able to predict what that electricity is going to cost you exactly in 25 years' time. There's not global uncertainty over, well, what happens if, a conflict starts up or a trade route becomes not available or whatever. Those things don't happen anymore. So that's a huge positive, right? We can think about stability in energy prices. Most of the activity of humans is energy related. That's a huge positive. You think about net zero, you think, well, that's going to provide certainty of costs for the future, lower inflationary pressures. You're not going to have events like the cost of living crisis, which is caused almost directly by an energy transition of sorts, not a net zero energy transition, but an energy transition from one supplier to another. So that's a huge positive. The other huge positive is air quality and pollutants. If we think about, if you go to the, beautiful city of Paris, right? Often Paris has poor air quality that will be limiting people's lives. It's well understood in scientific literature the effect that air quality has on people's lives. And in a net zero world, that will be hugely improved. Even hydrogen, even if it's burnt, will produce much less particulates and gases that are hazardous to health than a fossil fuel will. So that's again, that is a huge positive. The consequence is based on a timing question. Is if we stick to a rigid time and we don't invest early enough in innovation, technology innovation for that transition, then net zero is going to be limiting to its people. It's either going to mean that you can't go on holiday abroad as often as you want or far as you want or whatever, because you're going to have to live your life consumed by the amount of energy you're consuming in one way or another, whether that's the food on your table, the temperature of your home, the how far you go on holiday, those sorts of things. And at the moment, that does feel problematic to me. It's one thing to look 20, 30 years ahead and say, wouldn't net zero be great? And yes, it would. But we also have to consider quality of life for people. We have to consider people's choices. And no one wants a net zero, or very few people want a net zero transition where we're limiting people's choice. Right? We live in a free world, mostly. We want to make sure that is a free world that is maintained through a net zero transition. And that's why I think we've got to be really careful about net zero and embracing innovation. If every energy consumption event, so be that food, clothing, technology, travel, whatever, if all of those methods of consuming energy and fossil fuels were able to solve in the market for a net zero version, everybody would do it, right? You just would. If there was a choice between a fossil fuel one and there was no real deterrent in doing a renewable one, people would choose the renewable one. The reality is that isn't the case. So if you take an electric vehicle at the moment, most electric vehicles are a premium on top of the equivalent ICE version. That's just the reality. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not possible for everybody to drive a battery electric vehicle, but at some point, people have to make a cost decision about what they need in their lives. Everybody's lives are different. People are struggling with different things, living different lives. So you can't just say all drive BEVs. You can't. What you have to do is you have to say, what do we need to embrace in terms of technology to get it to the point where those BEV vehicles cost the same as an ICE. Then you have a market-driven energy transition, as in one market example, versus it being done by force, which I don't think works.
So, extracurricular question: when you say done by force, do you also include compliances in it? Because many governments are doing it. I know in India it is being done. The poor quality the poor air quality that we are currently suffering is also the result of a lot of leaders not wanting to acknowledge it.
Yeah.
Is there a correlation? Is there something governance can do to make sure that it works better?
I mean, it's a really tricky one because and this. So if we think about the challenge of how, let's say, how a company in Britain competes with someone in a different market that doesn't have the same governance and regulation, that then limits the opportunity of that economy, which directly affects the people at home. So you might say, well, what does the effect? And this isn't a fair example. What happens about the regulation difference between an Indian company operating in India and a British company operating in Britain? If they were different, it will negatively affect one exporting to the other. Right, because and if we live in a world with free trade, which I think we probably should do, as long as the playing field is level, then that's fine. So I get the perception that in the UK here, particularly at the moment with our new government, there is a concern that we will strangle UK industry for a desire of net zero, which is a just desire, but to the detriment of the people in the UK operating in an international community. And that's the real challenge. You can't have one without the other. You need to embrace one without the other. You can't have a free trade agreement with someone who treats food regulation differently, for instance. If someone's able to mass produce it at lower quality, you can't you can't compare like for like, and you may strangle one over the other. And so that's why this transition is really tricky, because you need to consider all these different things. Like I said, things that contribute to air quality. A lot of that is burning coal and things like that, but it's and fossil fuels in general that produce particulates. But it's also, think about brake particulates and rubber particulates in tires for vehicles, right? It's not just what comes out the tailpipe; it's more connected. So we need to think about but what's the time for people banning rubber tires? If it's a particulate, if that is, well, then why are we setting an industry date that says, industry, you need to innovate for this challenge that there are no particulates that come off tires by 2050, right? Because that then that's not net zero, that's clean air, although the activity around producing tires has something to do with net zero, of course. But that's why it needs to be a collective thing. We say, what world do we want to live in? Clean water, clean air, these sort of, renewable energy, those sorts of things. It needs to be a strategy connecting all of those threads, not just one of them, not in peaks and troughs, all at the same time. And again, we need to think about this in terms of how we fit in the international community.
So probably multilateral agreements, all governments agreeing on one thing, probably quality standardization across industries. But there's a long way to go. Technology is not the only thing that we need right now.
No, absolutely. Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah.
So those are the things I wanted to ask you about. Unless there is something else that you want to tell us about, some near future, something great which will come up, which will help us to breathe easy. At this point in time in India, we have one of the world's most polluted cities. Our capital is like stifled. People are not able to breathe. Is there any recourse? Is there anything which can help?
Well, as I said, the energy transition that's market driven. I mean, take solar in India, right? Solar is is a rich source of energy potential in India. India's big, so that helps. You need land to be able to do things like solar. And right now, it is cheaper to put a solar park in than it is to build a coal-fired power plant, right? And so that's good. These things are going to happen. We should see the energy transition, especially when it's market-driven in that sense, as a positive thing, right? It's not a negative. Obviously, there'll be a lot of subsidized industries like the fossil fuel industry that will feel aggrieved by that, but it's the market driving it away. In the same way as the whaling industry in the 1800s stopped because of the fossil fuel industry. It's the same thing. I'm sure lots of the whalers complained, but it's the reality is it was a market-driven transition. Yes. We need to make sure this one is, and politicians need to care. And again, it's quite interesting. If we think about, we often hear phrases like 400 parts per million, where we're talking about the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. People should open up that to the concentration of particulates in the atmosphere. Take the smog that exists on industrialized cities all over the world. If we had a common language to talk about how relatively polluted these things were, so my air is 100 or whatever the scale would be, and that would become general part of the general the way it was talked about. Then actually it would help, when you come to vote the next mayor of Indian cities or your next politician, if they were able to say, oh, our manifesto is that we're going to reduce this by 20% over 5 years or whatever, but just so that we're actually talking about it in the town halls, as it were. As well as CO2, because CO2 is a small part of the net zero. It really is. And it's, as I said, clean water. Why aren't we talking about the cleanliness of water in a way that it enables us to communicate with others, so that we can say, well, our rivers are a score of 10 and your rivers are a score of 2. Do you know what I mean? That we can actually build that into the way we demand from our governments what they deliver to us, and the companies and the enterprises that support those governments.
That I think is a very, very critical point, because, so much of work goes into it, and some lack of regulation or control just, undoes the whole thing.
It does, yeah.
All right. So that brings us to the end, and thank you so much for your time, Tom.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much for being with us. Please do follow us on social media for regular updates and new content.